Hello, everyone. My name is Juan, and this is Green Supply Chain Insights, a web series where I bring in my own perspective on green supply chain management, the current state of the industry, and some exciting innovations in this landscape. In today's episode, I'll be exploring a very trendy concept, one that I'm sure you've heard of before: net zero emissions. In recent years, around the world, nations have been setting their net zero emissions targets. As of April 2024, only three countries in the world don't have a national net zero commitment: Syria, Libya, and Bolivia. And while most nations have non legally binding targets, today there are over 30 with legally binding targets by 2050 or before. The idea of net zero dates back to the late 2000s, when researchers studying how the atmosphere, the oceans, and the carbon cycle were reacting to CO2 emissions. They found that global warming will only stop if CO2 emissions are reduced to net zero. Today, net zero is compared to 1990 emissions. This was basic to the goals of the Paris Agreement, which stated that the world must achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions, basically emissions caused by humans, and emission removals by the second half of this century. That's what led us to that mid century target of 2050. We fast forward to today, and more than 90% of the world's economy is covered by some sort of target aiming for net zero emissions between 2050 and 2070. Given that it's been little over a decade since that first paper was published indicating the need for net zero emissions to halt global warming, this certainly represents a remarkably rapid progress. Still, setting targets is only the first part of the job. The most challenging part, of course, remains ahead. And this is where our global industrial complex plays a key role. The only way these nations achieve their net zero targets is if it trickles down to the businesses that operate within their borders. Thankfully, they have. According to Net Zero Tracker, the number of companies with net zero targets rose by nearly 70% in the past 2 years, from just over 700 in 2022 to over 1,100 in 2024. It's a significant growth considering just 1 year before, in 2021, the first seven organizations announced their net zero targets. And that's all great, but we also need to look at their progress, right? So, how can companies reduce their emissions? Well, step one is, of course, they need to measure and report them. While some have been reporting on the impact of their corporate activities on the environment, this used to be a voluntary effort. However, with the introduction of CSRD in Europe in 2023, some organizations are now required to publish regular and audited reports on sustainability. Once they have an auditable, transparent, and trusted emissions reporting system, they need to move to reduce those emissions. And they can do this by transforming their industrial processes, by phasing out fossil fuels and other carbon intensive materials and energy sources. These are all, of course, excellent routes to save up on carbon emissions, but unfortunately, those alone won't be enough to truly reach net zero. This is where the concept of carbon credits comes into the picture. Carbon credits are essentially permits to allow an organization to produce a certain amount of carbon. In the scope of carbon neutrality and net zero emissions, companies will eventually only be able to produce as much carbon as they have captured. The easiest comparison for this is forestation. Trees capture carbon as they grow. This in turn produces credits for the business who planted it to emit carbon in their own activities. There are many other ways to capture carbon, some that are even much more valuable when it comes to further utilizing the captured carbon to create new products like fuels or construction materials. Today, the whole ecosystem of carbon credits is split into two markets: a compliance market and a voluntary market. The compliant market, as the regulated one, is what several countries have, where industries with high greenhouse gas emissions are capped on the amount of emissions permitted by law for their operations. Examples of this include the European Emission Trading System, the California Cap and Trade Program, and the broader Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the US. These regulations require such industries to then obtain carbon credits in order to meet the regulatory reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But let's take a closer look at one of them. Set up in 2005, the EU ETS was the world's first international emissions trading system. It provided free allowances for European businesses to emit up to a certain cap. Anything beyond their cap had to be offset against purchased credits. The thing is, with net zero in sight, these excess emissions that had to be compensated via credits in the EU ETS will eventually be phased out. This will happen over the next decade, where the free allowances, as we know them today, are to be replaced with the world's first carbon border tax, which will take into effect in 2026. This is the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, which will initially apply to imports of carbon-intensive products with the highest risk of carbon leakage. Iron and steel, cement, aluminum, and electricity are on that list. There were two main drivers that led to CBAM. One, of course, is to further advance towards net zero. And two, making foreign firms and competitors pay the same price as European industries. In other words, when the EU ETS came into force to reduce emissions in these capital-intensive sectors of the European economy, this worked. It worked to reduce emissions locally and certainly made for a more sustainable Europe. However, it had an adverse effect in competitiveness and in carbon leakage, relocating certain production operations to countries with a more lax approach to emissions and then importing those goods into the EU. This became an unfair advantage to foreign players, and at the same time, it allowed emissions to continue to run loose, if you will, with climate change being a global issue. This, of course, needed to be revised. So CBAM aims to prevent that carbon leakage while at the same time ensuring the competitiveness of EU producers. Implementation of CBAM will initially focus on the reporting embedded in the emissions of those goods. So what we want is now for goods to have a sort of carbon passport as they cross the border into Europe. In addition to these compliance markets for carbon credits, we have a voluntary market as well. In a way, this is an approach used by companies who claim to want to do more than they are regulated mandate, right? When it comes to climate change and decarbonization, they want to take further steps. So in voluntary markets, companies buy carbon credits to achieve carbon neutrality or their climate goals through these credits. While the compliance market is highly regulated by a central party, the voluntary market is largely unregulated. It is, in a way, governed by independent standards, with Verra and Gold Standard being the most well-known ones. These standards should ensure the credibility and the quality of the carbon credits. The good news here is that there are certainly benefits to the more liberal nature of the voluntary market. For example, data shows that companies engaged in voluntary market outperform their peers in climate action. 59% of buyers in the voluntary market reported lower gross emissions year on year, compared to only 33% of companies not participating in carbon markets. The not so good news is the quality of the credits. A recent study published in Nature demonstrated that the demand for low quality credits by major companies is undermining the integrity of the voluntary carbon market. There are growing concerns that many of the projects supplying these carbon credits on the voluntary market are of low quality, and they fail to achieve the emissions reductions claimed by their developers. So one of the reasons for this is the type of credits that are linked to the projects. You can have removal credits, which is when CO2 is actually physically removed from the atmosphere. An example of this is carbon capture and reutilization. We can capture and compress carbon and then use it to create a kitchen countertop, for instance. But you can also have avoidance credits. Avoidance credits are given to projects that prove to be replacing a fossil fuel alternative. For example, a renewable energy plant, where the argument is that thanks to the renewable energy plant, fossil fuels aren't burned to produce that energy, meaning then emissions are avoided. This study showed that 97% of the credits came from avoidance projects. They looked at 20 companies over the past 4 years. And while I think avoiding emissions is, of course, a huge part of our road to net zero, I don't think it should come in the form of offsets. In other words, yes, companies, of course, should be purchasing renewable energy to power their facilities, but they shouldn't use a solar plant in Brazil to offset their burning of coal in the US. Another issue was the longevity of the project. Two-thirds of the credits came from projects aged a decade or more, meaning companies are not supporting new climate initiatives. Again, while I believe reforestation is, of course, important, a company shouldn't be offsetting their emissions in 2024 from a forest planted in 2013. So when it comes to carbon credits, there's two main conclusions to draw, right? The long-term one is that the voluntary and the compliance markets will inevitably merge, especially in nations where the net zero targets are legally binding. The short-term one is that we need the voluntary market to be even more transparent, and we need companies to be more accountable in their execution in matters of decarbonization. Luckily, European climate law continues to advance to strengthen important aspects of EU climate governance, and doing so now more than ever with a global impact. Of course, further reforms are needed to make that climate neutrality a reality and to ensure that this is done based on a resilient economy with sustainable growth. I leave you with that, and as usual, I hope you found today's insights interesting. Remember, you can find new episodes monthly. They are published on LinkedIn, on YouTube, or you can find this and all previous episodes in finwood.com/insights. Thank you for watching and see you next month.